Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, a podcast that aims to provide valuable information to young saxophonists and music students in a digestible amount of time. I'm Owen Robinson, and today I will be interviewing Dr. Nathan Bogert, professor of saxophone at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. Dr. Bogert, it's great to have you on the show today.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. The first question I wanted to ask you today is, one of the attributes of a proficient saxophonist is a rich, dark tone that is even across all registers. Are there any particular warm-ups or exercises that you incorporate into your practice routine that you feel have helped you with both quality and consistency of sound?
It's a good question. I think that the first part of the question that always kind of makes me pause a little bit when I hear that word is this word dark, because when you do blind interviews with the general public or even with musicians about dark and bright and those kinds of things, you end up with this really vast sort of range of answers. Some people, what they call the brightest, some people call the darkest, so that word dark always is interesting to me. I think I know what you're getting at. I think I would put it more in terms of like a warm sound, right? I like to think of the warmth of my sound rather than dark or bright or anything like that, because I think, in concert saxophone, one thing that we maybe some folks have strayed away from is the presence of some brilliance in the sound, some of the overtones in the sound. And I really I like that in the sound. Obviously it has to be well controlled and focused and all the things that you said, but just to circle back, I think the idea of warmth is more poignant in my mind about sound rather than dark or bright. So as far as exercises that I do, warm-up exercises that I do to incorporate the consistency and quality of sound into my playing, I would say the first thing that I do is I often think about just simple tunes that I know. And this is something that I talk with my students a lot about, is I think about tunes that are sort of ubiquitous in our culture, whatever your culture is, whatever your background is, a tune that really well and you have it in your mind, if you were to sing that song, what would it sound like? So for instance, if I'm just thinking off the cuff, the national anthem of the United States, that's a song that people who live in this country, we hear that and we usually have an idea of what that would sound like in our mind. If we were great singers and we could sing that, we have an idea pretty much right away. And so I think I like to warm up with just simple melodies and things that I can really zero in on. How's my sound? How's my pitch? If I'm going to use vibrato, how is the vibrato? What type of vibrato? Those kind of things. So I do a lot of warming up just with melodic figures, whether it be a full melody or just part of a melody. And then I use a lot of wider intervals in my warming up. I will play fifths and sixths and even octaves and things like that, just to really see, am I maintaining the integrity of my core in my sound, when I'm starting to play. So and that type of warming up also helps me really key in on, is this a reed that's really working for me? Because sometimes we get a reed that, wow, this sounds really great in altissimo, or it sounds really great in the palm keys, but it doesn't sound it sounds really airy and stuffy in the lowest part of the horn, or vice versa. Wow, this reed is really responsive and it speaks really easily. But when I really want to throw my fastball and play double F in a palm key, it just, it's hard to control. So those kind of warm-up exercises that I do with melody and wider intervals really help me to key in on a lot of things. And most of all, my sound and how my setup for that day is working for me. Yeah, that's probably the shortest version I could give of something concrete that I definitely do every day or every time that I pull out my horn. I just start with something really slow and really familiar. And at this point in my life, sometimes those familiar melodies are melodies from concert saxophone repertoire, because those are really familiar to me because I listen to that every day. So, but yeah, I would say that's probably the simplest explanation of what I do for that sort of thing in my warming up.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great answer. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that it's kind of an applied warm-up process. I mean, you are thinking about melody and, your core and integrity of sound and pitch, things that all are going to show through in an actual performance, which
it kind of goes into this idea that I talk a lot about with my teaching and with my students, is about this idea of a holistic approach to playing. And it could be any instrument, right? Like when I'm playing, I've really gotten away from this, I don't know about you, but when I was young, I would pick up a new piece, especially something that was technically difficult. And I would say to myself internally, like, okay, I'm going to learn all the notes and apply all the fingerings, and then I'll go back and I'll put in all the other stuff, right? Like the dynamics or the articulations or the whatever it might be, the rubato or the changes in tempo, things like that. I would just learn the techniques separately from all the other components of the music. And then as I've gotten older, I don't believe in doing it that way at all. I think whenever you start something, you should be thinking about as many of the components as you possibly can simultaneously. How's my pitch? How's my sound? How's my articulation? How's my, how are all the things that I think about, my fundamentals and just my interpretation? How are all of those things happening in real time? And whatever, I also tell my students, there's no magic number. It doesn't mean you don't pick up a piece and say, okay, I'm going to start half speed. Whatever speed you need to go so that you can be thinking actively about all of those components. That's your number. And some people's numbers are different than others. Some people some things come easier to other people that, we all have our strengths and weaknesses. So I really like to think whatever tempo you need to go to really grasp as many of the components as you possibly can at the same time. That's, to me, in my opinion, that's a much more efficient way of learning a piece of music than, learning the technique and the fingerings and all of that, and then going back in and adding the sort of, if you want to say, the expressive qualities of your playing. One important thing to keep in mind about that process is that your interpretation can change. It evolves, from day one with the piece to when you get close to performance time. So just because you're thinking about something on the first day and you've decided to do it a certain way doesn't mean that you can't change that over time. So I would say, as I said, it really ties into this idea of a holistic approach to practicing and to studying, trying to do as many things, making sure you're doing all of the things well and correctly, as you see the word correctly anyway, from the beginning of the process, rather than compartmentalizing each different thing.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
So my next question is, I think that it goes without saying that when playing chamber music or any kind of music, intonation is vitally important to giving a good performance. What are some things that you have done throughout your career to train your ear?
Yeah, that's a great question and a funny anecdote that I'll share. When I started, when I did my undergraduate degree at Ball State, actually, which is such a privilege and an honor to be teaching there now. But when I studied with George Wolfe at Ball State, I remember, I was coming out of high school and I was a good player, as high school players go. I mean, I was playing some pretty significant repertoire even in high school. Whether I was playing it well or not is a whole different story. But I was playing it, and I was getting around it with a certain amount of competency. And I remember probably the first month that I was at Ball State, I remember really vividly having a lesson, and Dr. Wolfe just kind of stopped me and he said, you can play all the notes really well. Your technique is really good, but he said, you're really not playing in tune very often. So it just sort of became, it was one of those moments that was sort of devastating, but really transformative for me, because what I did, and I'm not saying this is an efficient way of doing it, but what I did at that stage in my naivete was I went into practice rooms every day and I just sat there with the piano, checked the piano against a tuner, and I would just play the note on the piano, and then I would play it on my horn, and I realized that even without knowing all of the nomenclature about voicing or tongue position or, air column, or without having any awareness of any of those things, I started to sort of learn that, oh, okay, that note, when I play it in tune, it actually sounds different than what I've been playing it all my life, because I haven't really been focused on playing it in tune. I was just trying to play the note, and I think that's very common when we're really young. But it was really transformative for me, as I said, because it sort of revealed to me, oh wow, I'm really in the wrong place when I'm playing. My natural position is really off, especially in the higher registers of the instrument. So that was, I would say, the first stage of my growth with listening, was just really just sitting in a room with a piano and playing notes and trying to match the pitch, as closely as I could. And then, so I sort of was recalibrating my ear to, oh, that's actually what palm key E sounds like when it's in tune, and so that was a really helpful process. What I've done beyond that time, and it's been over the course of many years, is really, thinking about, I use drones a lot. I do use drones a lot because I find that practicing with drones is not only really helpful to my ears, it's also sort of a meditative experience for me. Even as I was talking earlier about playing simple melodies and things, if you take a drone and play that melody over the drone, not only are you in tune with that unison note, but also how are your intervals being tuned to that fundamental pitch, and that has been really helpful because, we all know that if you were to play every note, especially in chamber music, if you were to play every note where the needle was straight up and down, it would not sound in tune, right? Because there are certain tendencies of intervals that we have to compensate for in order to really get the quote unquote in tune phenomenon to happen. So I think that, using drones, using my tuner, but also one thing I really talk about a lot is hearing intervals before I play them. I like to think about, and this starts, when you're first starting out with theory in whatever age you are, hopefully younger, but if it's your first year of college, then that's pretty normal, I think, for a lot of people. But really taking those ear training classes to heart, something I wish I had done more seriously back then, and just really sort of trying to internalize, what does a major third sound like? What does a minor third sound like? And then through the lens of a saxophonist, understanding what you need to do. And we could go on and on about what we talk about with positioning or airstream or tongue position or anything like that. What you need to do in order to get that pitch as the result, I guess, is what I would say. So I think, using drones, thinking about my basics, as far as ear training goes while I'm playing. And then the other thing that I do a lot is I will, I really try to do a lot of score study and find out those moments where I find myself having trouble. I really like to get into, okay, well, where am I in relationship to the harmony that's underneath, and what is my tendency, and then what do I need my result to be, because sometimes those things are at odds, right? Like what the instrument wants to do, but what the harmony requires us to do, so I do a lot of score study with knowing sort of where I fit in the larger picture, as far as an intonation is concerned. But yeah, those would be probably the big 3 or 4 things that I do as an individual, when it comes to pitch and working on training my ears.
Yeah, for sure. I use drones pretty often. I find them to be super helpful, especially, when you get into quartet and even band music, any kind of ensemble playing. It's super helpful. I've found also that I try my best to think in solfege, especially when I'm like away from the instrument.
Sure.
Like movable do solfege, where the root is do, and I find that to be really helpful, somewhat for intonation, somewhat just for like, understanding melody and things like that. But,
Yeah.
I'm fairly slow at it, but it really does help. Like if I think of something as if I'm singing it, it can really help me to play in tune.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole school of pedagogy around this idea of like, if you can sing it, you can play it, and how you choose to interpret that as far as what the manifestation of that sort of that adage goes, I think is up for interpretation. But the idea being, if you can pull the pitches out internally, before you actually go to play them, then that will really help guide your ear to sort of naturally do things in order to get that result, that you're already hearing it before you actually need to play it.
Dr. Bogert is the soprano chair of the Coalescent Quartet, and for those who haven't checked them out yet, you can find them on YouTube, where they have released recordings of all of Fernand de Crook's variations saxophoniques. Dr. Bogert, what are some important ideas or concepts that young saxophonists should consider when they begin playing chamber music?
Yeah, that's a great question, and my answers have certainly changed over the years. I think honestly, the biggest, how to phrase this, the biggest things that come to mind right away are going into a chamber music situation with the true spirit of collaboration. I think is really, really crucial, because we all want to be the best player that we can be. We all want to play in chamber groups that play at a really high level, and that's I would assume that we would, if we were doing it in a sort of professional or high level collegiate student, or even I actually shouldn't put it in those terms, but when we go into a chamber music situation, we all want it to be a really good experience. I guess that's the easiest way to say it. And having the sort of awareness and the humility to understand that in especially if we're talking about saxophone quartet, a lot of times when we're starting out, the person who's playing tenor or soprano or baritone probably doesn't have a whole lot of experience doing that at a really high level, And so there's a learning curve there. And so the reason I say that having that spirit of collaboration is because, giving people the grace to grow, while you're developing as a group, I think is a really important lesson that I learned the hard way, because I tend to, I guess my on switch is always on, like I tend to be really hypercritical of myself, and sometimes overly so of other people. And I think that I'm still learning about that, still learning about, understanding that if I want people to be understanding and patient and compassionate with any issues that I may be having as a member of a group, I have to return that, to the other members of my group, whatever it might be. So I think that, like I said, the spirit of collaboration, because collaboration isn't just sharing music. It's also, as from the work you're doing with your quartet, you're traveling together, there's fellowship, all of those things. And so wanting to work with people and share with them on lots of different levels and have really positive outcomes, I think really requires that we, are empathetic toward one another, in all facets of the experience of being in a chamber group, right? I mean, the playing, as I said, we all want the playing to be at a really high level. That's usually a given, but getting there often requires a lot more than just everybody being a good musician. It's everybody having patience. It's everybody having a certain level of maturity to understand, that certain things happen that you can't anticipate and you can't predict, and you have to be adaptable and flexible with your fellow chamber musicians. And I think that, so as I said, having that really specific dedication to collaborating with people more so than just making music, I think is really important when it comes to playing chamber music. That's one thing that I think, if I could go back in time, I would try to do a lot better with just connecting with the people in the groups rather than just thinking about the music, right? I mean, the music is the ultimate expression of the experience that we're having together in a chamber music group. But I think if you can really connect with the people you're making music with on a very personal level, that really gives the music a sense of maturity and a sense of purpose that I think is hard to define, but if you really enjoy just being in the presence of the people you're making music with, I think it has a really profound effect on the music that you end up making. So that's one concept I think is really important. Another concept I would just impress upon all musicians, in a chamber setting is a sense of mutual respect, and we can think about that in terms of preparation, just in terms of decorum, all of those kinds of things, right? Like if you're in a group and you're rehearsing 2 or 3 times a week, I think being prepared for rehearsal is a really crucial part of that too, right? Because everybody in your group is busy, everyone's busy. So being busy is not a reason to not sort of be pulling your weight, so to speak, right? So preparation and just professionalism, I think, are really important. And then I guess the last thing I would say on that note is planning. I think a lot of times when you're young and you're starting out with a group, it's like, okay, we're going to get together on Tuesday and we're going to rehearse. And then we're going to get together on Friday and we're going to rehearse. And then we've probably all had that experience when the days come, you spend the first 20 minutes going like, okay, well, what are we going to work on today? Like what are we going to do today? Now that we're warmed up, like, what do we want to do? And then more often than not, something ends up being put on the back burner, and then you're sort of trying to cram that one piece or that one movement when it comes closer to performance time. And I think one way to really help mitigate that phenomenon is to really plan, and as I said, that can tie into just the professionalism and the mutual respect idea, in the sense that knowing that all of your fellow musicians are busy and knowing that they're all being pulled in lots of different directions, especially if you're thinking about people who are in school, letting everybody know very clearly, okay, this is what we're going to work on at the next rehearsal, whether it be a whole movement or a section or, multiple sections of multiple movements, I think is a really helpful strategy that will help the rehearsals be much more productive and much more efficient. Because especially if you're working, a competition or something, and you're working on an hour's worth of quartet music, it can be really daunting to sit there with your quartet folder and just look at it and go, okay, I got to practice all this for the next rehearsal, which is 2 days from now. So I think having that kind of planning as part of your weekly rehearsal, or every time you rehearse, I think that is a really, really important part of being productive and being efficient as a chamber group when you get together, so that you can just sort of hit the ground running. Once the horns are warmed up and once everybody's feeling good, it's like, okay, boom, let's get right down to it. And the work begins.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think, preparedness is crucial, not only like for the good of the group, but also it definitely can alleviate a lot of tension that comes from people being unprepared. I think it's when 1 or 2 people come to rehearsal and they're not prepared, and I think everybody's been there, where it's like, I just really don't have this part yet. That can be like frustrating for everyone. And just putting in even just a little bit of work on each piece beforehand can make a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of the first thing I was saying about that kind of, a true spirit of collaboration. I think it's important, and to tie that into the second thing I said about, preparedness and preparation, is like understanding that, my part, if I'm playing baritone or if I'm playing soprano, my part might be really, really nasty hard at this certain section that we're working on. So if I don't have an idea or an indication from, if we don't make a decision as a group, we're going to work on this specific thing for the next rehearsal, well, not only do I have this one part that's really extraordinarily difficult that I've got to try and work on and have at the level of my other chamber musicians in the group, but I've also got all the other stuff too, right? So then, like you said, you can get in these really frustrating situations where you feel, most of the time, in my experience, it's an unwarranted frustration, because you start going to that sort of binary place where it's like, well, this person either cares or they don't care. This person is either prepared or they're not prepared. This person is either taking it seriously or they're not taking it seriously. And usually it's not so polarized like that, right? Like that's usually not the case. Sometimes there's just external factors that we can't control that make it so that one person's might be, or two people might be having a really hard time with getting a certain thing. And so that takes more time. And so we have to have that, we have to give each other that grace and that respect by, setting an expectation as far as planning the rehearsals, and also understanding that everyone is playing a different part, and as I said, one part for one person might be fairly straightforward, but for another person could be extremely difficult. And so I think planning really helps mitigate those frustrations that you were talking about, so that you can observe, okay, we said we were going to do this and we all did this, and there we go.
For sure. So here's a question that I ask everybody that
Sure.
I interview. From a teacher's perspective, how do you strike the balance between encouragement and criticism while helping students reach their full potential as an artist?
Wow, that's a great question. Okay, where to begin? I'll be the first person to admit that early on in my career as a teacher, I definitely trended more toward the critical, and it never from a place of I'm being critical because I don't like how you're playing, or I'm being critical because I don't think you're taking it seriously, but more like when somebody steps in my office and it's time to get down to business, I'm thinking like, okay, let's get down to business, and if somebody's, and again, this is my own fault and this was my own deficiency to say, or to think of it on this level. Somebody plays something for me, and let's just say they're playing with a beautiful sound and they're playing with good intonation, but maybe their technique is a little ragged or it's not as clean as it should be. Rather than spend time focusing on the things that they were doing right, my mind would jump straight to, let's talk about the things that you need to do better, right? And the feedback that I would get would be a lot of like, I wish that things were more positive. I wish that things were more positive. So then you start to, you start to think like, well, okay, if this becomes a pattern in the feedback that I'm getting from students, then clearly it's probably got something to do with how I'm presenting the information. Doesn't mean that anything that I was saying was malicious or intended to be negative or anything like that. It's just, obviously there's something else that I need to be doing in order to as part of your question, to be encouraging. And I remember having some really sort of soul crushing moments where I would read some of this feedback and be like, wow, like I don't feel, I don't raise my voice at my students. I don't curse at my students. I don't say insulting things to my students, but even so, I was still being perceived as being hypercritical or negative, and even though I wasn't thinking of it that way, that was the perception, right? So I've really, in the last 4 or 5 years, really tried to make a concerted effort to not only talk about what we need to get better at. That's a guarantee. We're going to talk about that. That's why we have lessons, right? Like, I'm there to help you to, as you put it in your question, to reach your full potential as an artist. That's my responsibility, is to help you in that journey. But it's also part of my responsibility, and something I think about a lot now, to help you to foster your dedication and your passion for this thing that we're working on, right? And if I'm not saying anything encouraging, if I'm not being reassuring, if I'm not speaking about the positives of our experience together or the things that you're doing, then I'm probably not doing a great job fostering your passion for this thing that I love so much, So there was, early on in my life as a teacher, there was a disconnect there, that I'm so passionate about this thing, and I just want everyone else to be passionate about it and understand that I just want you to be better, and I'm trying to help you as much as I can. But there was a disconnect. And so now I really try to think of whenever someone plays for me, for everything, one thing that I say that's a critique of something that they're doing, I also try to think of at least one positive thing, and I find that that's really helped to get through to not just my students, but students I work with in other places, that I'm here to help, like I'm here to be a force for good. I'm here to affect positive change in your life and in your experience with the instrument, with the music. And so, I always try to think about something positive to say in addition to sort of going down the list of the things that I want to talk about from a more critical standpoint. So sometimes it works out one-to-one, sometimes it doesn't, but that's something I really try to strategize in my own sort of mental preparation while I'm taking notes, while a student is playing, before it's my turn to speak. It's like, okay, I'm trying to take account of all the things, not just the things that we need to work on, but also being encouraging and giving the students reaffirmation of the things that they're doing that are really great, that I really like, or that I just think are very satisfying from an artistic or musical standpoint, So I think that balance is really important. Again, it's a lesson that I learned the hard way. And I'm not ashamed to admit that, because I think all of us who teach, you realize, you're going to have to work on things with students that you never anticipated having to work on. You're going to encounter situations that you never anticipated being a part of. And what you choose to do in those situations can have a really profound impact on the student's experience. And I think I just take a lot more care now with that dynamic of positive and critical. So I like to think that I'm getting better. It's a thing I still struggle with at times, but I definitely think it is very important to have that balance, and there are some people, when I see them teach, I am always just astounded at how well and how naturally they're able to achieve that balance. For instance, and I'll just say, I don't know if it's maybe what you were looking for, but your teacher, Professor Lulov, I've never heard him say a negative word about anybody. And just his spirit when you're around him is so sort of like infectious in a positive way, that it never surprises me that there are so many great players that have come out of that studio, because it's like, well, you not only do you have a great model, but you also have a great mentor, and you have a great positive force in your life with saxophone and with music to help guide you, and it's just it has always seemed so natural when I've observed him teaching. And there are certainly many, many others. I'm just putting it in terms of in a context that you can relate to directly. But, I really am actively thinking more about how to capture that essence of positivity, but also productivity, with the time that I have with my students. So definitely a really important balance. And so my sort of facile way of dealing with that in the beginning, after realizing I was having that disconnect, was to, okay, for everything I'm going to talk about that needs to get better, I'm also going to talk about something that I think is really great. And that again, as facile as it may seem, has really helped me strike a better balance with my students in all contexts.
I think it's really interesting, to consider just the vast amount of different learning styles, the nuance in how each individual student learns and how each teacher teaches. I've talked to other teachers who have noticed over time that some students respond better to mostly criticism. They kind of are just on board with, okay, I'm here for constructive criticism, comments. And other students kind of shut down with that sort of only critical teaching, even if it's not, and I don't think it usually is in the collegiate conservatory setting. I don't think it's usually any kind of, malicious or degrading criticism from any teacher really in any school, but it's, I think some students do need that reassurance, that positive affirmation,
Yeah. I mean, I think I can say in my own experience, and I've seen just about anybody you can think of, I've probably seen them teach in a masterclass setting. I can't think of one instance where and I'm not saying this has never happened, but I can't think of one instance where I observed somebody who I thought said something that was really meant to insult or degrade the student. Now, I've seen people say some things that were pretty cutting, and I'm sure I've said some things to students that were perceived as a really cutting thing, but you're absolutely right that you really have to pay really close attention. That's a responsibility as a teacher. You have to pay close attention to what each student needs. And that's something I really believe in, not only from a curricular standpoint, but just from a personal standpoint, because, the student that you described of like taking really well to, strictly critical styles of teaching, that was me. In my life, all the teachers that I studied with, it was like, and again, I never took it personally. I never was, insulted by it. It was just like, okay, that's their role in my life, right? Is to tell me what I need to do differently so that I can get better. And so, a teacher could really lean pretty hard on me, and it resonated with me. I don't want to say I could handle it, because I think that implies that students who don't learn well that way can't handle it. And I don't think that's a fair assessment. But all goes to say that style of teaching really resonated with me. And then when I became a teacher, well, obviously the thing I'm going to be most familiar with and that I'm going to do the most naturally is to echo the sentiments of my teachers, right? But then you find out really quickly, oh, well, that doesn't work for everybody. Everybody can't function in that capacity as far as only thinking about the critical, because then they feel really beat down or they feel really discouraged by that kind of teaching. And so you've got to the original question, you've got to find that balance. How can we be productive and, again, foster that enthusiasm simultaneously? And sometimes that's really tricky, but nobody ever said that being a teacher was easy. So
no, they did not.
Yeah.
I think some people try to, but it's not true.
They've never taught.
Exactly.
They've never taught.
So I'm going to ask just one of my more general questions.
Sure.
How do you stay healthy while leading the busy lifestyle of a musician?
Wow. I may not be the authority on staying healthy. I've certainly had my own personal journey with my personal health, and I'm in a better place than I've ever been with my personal health. And I guess the easiest response I could give to that is I just try to stay active. I would just use, for instance, the last 2 weeks before this week, my Coalescent Quartet, we were in residency at the Avaloq Farms Music Institute, which is a pretty remote setting, about 20 minutes away from Concord, New Hampshire. And, they have a workout room, but it's a very simple, there's some basic equipment and a treadmill and that kind of thing. But I go to the gym 2 hours a day, every day. That's something I just have implemented in my life the last 3 to 4 years, that's what I do. And it helps with my mental health. It helps with my physical health. It just helps me feel better. I'm not advocating that everyone should go to the gym that often, but for me, it's sort of become an obsession/addiction for me. And so I really value that time that I spend exercising. But, so you get thrown into a situation where you're sort of out in the middle of, there's no Planet Fitness or YMCA nearby. So you got to improvise. So, we made a point every day to, take walks, and some days we ran. There was a couple of days we ran 5 miles, and other days we use the treadmill and lift some weights and things like that. But in my own life, I like to play basketball a lot. That's something that I do pretty regularly. Just staying active, not letting myself become sort of stationary, I guess, is something that I really value, and that is really important to me. And I would just recommend it to everybody, to just stay moving, just keep get up and move. Whether that doesn't mean you have to work out, so to speak. That doesn't mean you have to play sports, but just get up and move around. Take a walk. Or get an exercise tape for your home that you can do in your own privacy. But staying active, getting your heart beating on a daily basis, I think is obviously there's a lot of science behind that's really important to our physical health. But the other thing that I've done, and this is just in my own life, it's not a soapbox or it's not advocacy for this way of being, but I try to be, I'm pretty strict with my weekly, what I eat. And that's something that has helped change my life and my relationship with my physical health. Obviously, with a long history of an abusive relationship with food, I have my own strategies to deal with that. And I certainly have my slip ups and my backsliding from time to time and that kind of thing. But I find that, if I can plan, if I can prep meals and things like that really helps me keep me accountable to not let myself slide, so to speak, to getting into these unhealthy cycles, where I'm sort of not being disciplined about what I eat or anything like that. So, and again, like I said, that's just for me, and that's something that's helped me, but that's probably the easiest description of what I would say about how I stay healthy. Is just, I try to be mindful of what I eat, and I try to continue to be active on a daily basis in some capacity. So nothing groundbreaking, nothing innovative, just try to be consistent and, try to be disciplined.
Thank you for listening. This concludes episode 6 of The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, featuring special guest Dr. Nathan Bogert, professor of saxophone at Ball State University. The music you heard in this episode was composed by Dorothy Chang, performed by Zachary Costello, alto saxophone, and Kiyumi Ra, piano. I am Owen Robinson, and this has been The Well-Rounded Saxophonist. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember to practice smart and stay healthy.